very much for welcoming Becca Duvall.
So I'm basically going to bring this thing down to the local level. Some of you I know have probably seen my presentation before, but hopefully you'll hear something a little bit different that you just didn't pick up the first time. Because I know I recognize a lot of your faces from various times. And many of you are actually already in CLGs or are commissioners or perhaps planners that staff CLG commissions. So we'll talk a lot about all of these different pieces. And I think really with what John has already talked about, just setting a framework. So why do we do this stuff? I know when you're standing in front of an audience at the Revitalize WA conference, I'm preaching to the choir, but we do this stuff because preservation helps to retain a sense of place in a community, whether it's a downtown or a neighborhood. It's that sense of place that people can't really, it's not a tangible thing, but it's something that you feel. It's environmentally friendly. You know, we talk about green all the time, and what's greener than something that's already built, infrastructure that already exists. Every community has its own unique heritage. It's not a made-up thing. It's not something that we manufacture. It's something that was built from the ground up, and that's what preservation helps protect. Also, the way that you're perceived by outside folks when they come into your community. If you have lots of empty, derelict buildings, if you have empty storefronts in your downtown, even if it's not true, you might have really wonderful historic neighborhoods. Probably not if your downtown is dying on the vine. But it's a symbol of the community's health, what those buildings look like. So that's another reason why we protect these historic resources. In tourism, as you know, people come to look at historic resources. They like to drive through historic neighborhoods. So that's just one of the other aspects. So preservation, I like to just kind of give you the framework, the big picture, is we've talked a lot, Bob talked about the National Park Service a little bit and some of that, those federal laws. Well, at the federal level, that's who we sort of answer to is the National Park Service. At the state level, we are the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, as has been mentioned several times, and then it filters down to the local level, and people are often surprised at how much power actually happens at the local level rather than the state or federal level. In some cases, the most power. So just a really brief explanation of what the National Park Service does and the framework for historic preservation is that Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And that's something that Bob mentioned really briefly. The Secretary of the Interior is really who oversees preservation through the National Park Service, but many times you'll hear terms like the Secretary of the Interior standards for professionals or standards for preservation or rehabilitation. That's where we get the Secretary of the Interior. The National Park Service also administers something called the Historic Preservation Fund, and this money is actually really important to both the state offices as well as local governments. State offices, we get a portion of the Historic Preservation Fund. That fund is actually derived from offshore oil drilling funds. So it's reappropriated each term of Congress, so we never know exactly how much money that can be, and it changes. But we actually get money at the state level, and then we filter it down to our certified local governments, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The National Park Service also manages the National Register of Historic Places. We're going to talk a little bit about those different registers and what they mean and what they don't mean. And they manage the federal investment tax credit. We do have a historic architect on our staff, Nick Van is his name, and he's the one that goes out and meets with developers when they're looking at doing federal tax credit projects. But ultimately, the National Park Service are the deciders on whether or not something gets to take advantage of that tax credit. So the State Historic Preservation Office, we were set up through that 1966 Preservation Act. Our boss is the State Historic Preservation Officer, and Allison is sitting in the back of the room. So we're lucky to have her with us. We're funded, as I mentioned, partly through that Historic Preservation Fund. We also get some state funds as well. I think we're probably almost like 60-40, probably, or even more. Lauren is our grants manager. What do we have, Lauren?
Actually, we have more state money than we do federal.
Oh, more state money than federal money. We use that for some grant funds and things like that as well, so I think that's what takes it up that way.
Where does the state money come from?
Where does the state money come from?
State money is general funds.
General funds, that's what I thought.
So the state money, 40% of what we get out of the state money is matched to the federal grant. And then some of the remaining general funds in state money are for other programs like Main Street, which is not part of the match, or local government archaeologists, Gretchen's going to be talking, or human remains programs. So we have programs that are not part of the national program that are funded separately.
Our office also has something called the Washington State Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and that is a group that's appointed by the governor. I think there are 9 of them. They come from all over the state of Washington. They meet 3 times a year generally, and their primary purpose is really to look at nominations for the National and State Register that are coming out of various jurisdictions in Washington. And then after they look at them, it's sent on to the National Park Service for the National Register listings, and they can actually list directly onto the Washington Heritage Register right at their meeting. As I mentioned, we administer the Washington Heritage Register, which is our state register of historic places. And we play a big part in what's called Section 106. And Section 106 is a part of that Act of 1966. Section 106 basically says that any federal action, it doesn't mean just federal money, it can be permitting or licensing, anything that requires federal action has to be looked at for its impact to historic buildings. So Section 106 is something that is left to our office to work with those federal agencies and determine whether or not there's any kind of adverse effect on historic properties, and if there are, then what kind of mitigating circumstances we can come up with to make it not so bad. So now we get down to local preservation programs. And this is where I come into play, helping local governments all across the state to pass historic preservation ordinances. That's the first step, is you have to have a preservation ordinance. And that ordinance has to do a couple very specific things. One, you have to create some sort of historic preservation commission. And that they are called all sorts of different things: landmarks boards, landmarks commissions, historic preservation commissions, they're design review commissions. There are all sorts of different things. It also creates a local register of historic places. So in order to have protection of resources at the local level, you have to have a local register. So in Wenatchee, they are a certified local government, and they have the Wenatchee Register of Historic Places. That's the same thing for all of those 50 CLGs across the state. Because that's the only place that you can truly protect historic properties, is through the local Register of Historic Places. The regulatory power comes in only when a building permit is sought for those buildings. So it's not something that we as preservationists go out and say, oh, you know, you're not doing the right thing to this building. We're a preservation police. We're going to issue you a ticket until you paint that building. It doesn't happen that way. It's a reactionary process for the most part. When a building permit is sought, then it comes before the Historic Preservation Commission to look at the plans and pass certificate of appropriateness. So I wanted to talk a little bit about these various registers, because there's a really big disconnect between what they really are and what people think that they are. So the National Register of Historic Places is probably the biggest misconception, is that people think that if you want to save a building, you've got to get it put on the National Register. And that then nobody can touch it, nobody can do anything to that building. Well, the truth of the matter is if something's put on the National Register, it goes all the way up to the National Park Service, it's passed, the day after it's listed on the National Register, a developer could come in, get a building permit for a demo the day after, and it can be demolished. Nobody has to be told, nobody has to ask if there's no federal involvement. Now, if there is federal involvement, they do have to ask. But if it's just a private business dealing, that building can be torn down the next day. There's actually no regulations that are associated with listing on the National Register. It really is an honorary designation with a somewhat difficult process to actually get listed on. So that's the National Register. Where a little bit of protection can come in is that Section 106 of the Preservation Act, where if there is some federal involvement, then our office is consulted. We can say, you know, putting a giant highway through a historic neighborhood will impact these buildings that are either on the National Register or even just potentially eligible for the National Register. We would love it if you would move this highway someplace else. Well, Federal Highways may say, well, thanks for your opinion, Dad, but that's the only place we can put that highway. What shall we do instead of moving our highway? And we can come up with, oh, well, you can survey other parts of the city for us. You can, create brochures. You can document the buildings that are coming down. But we can't say, hey, Federal Highways, we don't agree with your project. You have to stop. We can't do that. So that's where there's little to no protection. There might be mitigation, but not necessarily protection. So then we get to the Washington Heritage Register. And really, the Washington Heritage Register is an honorary designation only. It doesn't have any regulations that are associated with it. We don't actually comment on Washington Heritage Register properties that have, maybe through CFO we might be asked about those properties, but there really are no regulations associated with listing and no protection of those buildings. It really was created as a result of folks that weren't experts in preservation, that didn't necessarily want to go through all the trouble of trying to write a National Register nomination themselves or hire a professional to do it for them, but they wanted some sort of ability to say, we're on a list, we're on a register. And so the process for listing on the Washington Heritage Register is a lot lower than it is for the National Register. It's a pretty mom and pop kind of nomination. So then we get down to the local Register of Historic Places. And of course, these are all different because this program is set up differently in every jurisdiction. Let's say most of them are pretty much the same, but in a lot of jurisdictions, they follow our model ordinance that sets out everything they need to do to be a certified local government. In terms of, there's a few that have other things that they've added to their ordinances, but most of them have these same provisions. One of the big choices that you have to make in the very beginning when you're first putting together a historic preservation ordinance is when you have somebody listed on the local Register of Historic Places, do you get the consent of the owner for that listing, or do you not require consent of the owner? Most places in Washington require the consent of the owner. Not all, though. There are a couple communities in Washington that don't. I believe King County is one, City of Seattle. Tacoma, I actually don't think you have to have the consent anymore. I think they changed their ordinance a few years ago. So there's not very many that are like that. Most have to have compliance with the property owner to list. So as I mentioned before, what does it do? It allows for design review of changes that are going to be made to these locally designated properties. It's really intended to keep those key character defining features around. You want that, if the person who originally built or lived in that property was standing in front of it 120 years from the day that they first moved in, would they still recognize it? Would it be something that still spoke to them? Those are the kinds of things that we're looking at protecting. This can be either for individual landmarks or it can be for districts. We have both in Washington. These are all based on local ordinances, though. So there can be the ability to deny or delay demolition, and in some of those big cities, like Seattle, they can actually list your property without your consent if it meets the criteria for their local register, and then if you come in for a demolition permit, they can actually say, no, we're not going to let you demolish it. Now, do they do that? Not very often at all. They don't want to do that. There's a really kind of a case that a lot of people know about, the Denny's that was in Ballard. It was a Googie design Denny's building. And in that case, there was a really big grassroots effort to save the building. A developer had bought it. They wanted to tear it down and put in mixed use, because Ballard needs more mixed use. We all know that. There's not enough of that in Ballard. And so this groundswell of folks got together, and they actually did list the building on the Seattle Register. It became a Seattle landmark. But Seattle does something where they list a building and then they put another ordinance in that puts what regulations are associated. Some places call it a management agreement. For Seattle, I'm not sure exactly what they call it. But basically what they did is they listed it, that appeased the grassroots effort, but then when they actually put together the regulations that were associated, they didn't put any regulations. And the building was allowed to be demolished. So ultimately, really, I don't think anybody won. But the building's not there anymore, so I guess the developer won. So they can do those things, but in Washington we don't do it like the East Coast does. There also are a couple demolition by neglect ordinances. Port Townsend is one that has kind of been, well, they were the vanguard. It was the first of its kind in Washington. And Tacoma just actually recently passed a maintenance neglect type of an ordinance that we are giving them a SHPO award next week for, that basically says if you allow your property to just go into decay, then we will actually step in and make you fix things. So it doesn't happen very often in Washington because we're very much a voluntary kind of, preservation ordinances in Washington aren't super strict. But I'm glad to see that starting to happen because it's models out there for other communities to think about ways to protect those buildings and not let them just sit. So I wanted to tell you now, you have kind of got this framework about how preservation works. So the Certified Local Government Program is something that was an amendment to that 1966 Historic Preservation Act. And it happened in 1980. And so they basically created a partnership where local governments can partner with the state office and the National Park Service in what they call the Certified Local Government Program. It basically says that you have a commission, you're meeting regularly, you have some kind of protection mechanism, and that's through our local register of historic places, and that you're doing design review or protecting those properties when they are coming up for review. It also allows for you, as a certified local government, to participate in the National Register process. Basically, you look at it before our state advisory council looks at those nominations, and then it gets passed up the chain. So why would you even want to do this? Well, the partnership angle is nice. Access to technical assistance by our office, not just me, but also we have, a state architectural historian. We have Nick Van, as I mentioned, our state architect, planners like Greg. So we've got a lot of resources at the state level. The other really important aspect is that locally designated properties, so properties on your own local register that you have listed based on your own criteria, are eligible for something called special tax valuation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about special tax valuation in just a second. We also have a small grants fund that's available through our office. That historic preservation fund that I mentioned that gets trickled down through offshore oil drilling money and through the National Park Service to our office, 10% of that has to be passed through to our CLGs every year. So we always have grant funds. Sometimes they might be less grant funds, but we always have grant funds every year. And I think my next slide, yes, I wanted to show you. This is basically kind of the numbers that you're looking at in terms of grants. This is total. So you can imagine our grants generally are 8 to 10, maybe 12, sometimes $15,000. But in small communities, this really makes a big impact. They can be used for lots of different things, but I also like to mention that every other year for many, many years now, we have taken away our match component. Normally these are 60, we give you 60%, 40% has to come from the local government, and that doesn't have to be cash match. It can actually be staff time and volunteer time and other things like that. But this year that we just finished our application process for is a no match year. We've made the sort of executive decision, the powers that be at our office have said, when we have enough state money to match our federal funds, we don't need the CLGs to have to put their necks out and give us 40% match because we've already matched our federal requirement. So we're taking the match away, which allows communities like our tiny, tiny CLGs, Concrete, Harrington, Roslyn. These towns can come in and ask for $10,000, which they would never be able to match otherwise, and have a really substantial project in their community. So this is a no-match year. So what can you use these grants for? They can be for education things, workshops. We did actually a nice building code workshop in Spokane a few years ago about how to use historic building codes. The IEBC, did you go to that? No, oh yeah, it was actually, they brought in somebody, I think from New York, if any Spokane people, I think she was from New York. But so they can be used for lots of different things. Brochures, we used to get a lot of requests for brochures, but not so much anymore because websites and everything are out there. Planning, so we do preservation plans or, downtown preservation plans, zoning. survey and inventory is really the bread and butter of what we do for CLG grants. You don't know what you have unless you know what's out there. So we do a lot of documentation kinds of grants. Nominations, preparing National Register nominations, or even, we have done a few local district nominations. Special projects, we've actually helped Cle Elum with a couple of different rounds where they gave them some seed money for facade improvement grants. Now, normally we don't get involved in construction because you can see by the dollar amount that we have that we just don't have enough to make a meaningful impact. But with that seed money, we can have the local property owner actually match that dollar for dollar. And it really has gone a long way. And Cle Elum has probably improved about eight different properties through that program. We also helped Spokane many years ago with Hilliard. And Hilliard did some facade improvement grants as well. So there's lots of different creative things we can do. Historic structure reports, things like that. So special tax valuation, and I'm almost done, Greg. 5 minutes, perfect. We'll be perfect. As Bob mentioned, that enabling legislation was passed at the state level in 1985 for special tax valuation. And I always tell the story that I think some lawmaker, one of our legislators probably owned a historic building or a historic house, and they probably improved it a lot, and then they got hit with a significant tax bill the next time the assessor went around. And they thought, it's not really fair to punish people for improving their historic properties, because as we know, we are just the stewards of historic properties during our time, and we're just keeping them up for the next generation. So we should give these people a break when they actually do make significant improvements to keep these buildings in use. They shouldn't be punished, they should be celebrated. So basically, the local government says what property types are eligible. Most certified local governments, it's any building listed on the local register of historic places. Port Townsend is my one that only allows for commercial projects, but that's, yes, used to. Oh, did you change it? Oh, good. Okay, well, Port Townsend's not on my bad list anymore. Good job, Port Townsend. So they all allow for any property on their local register. And that's the beauty of special valuation. Residential, you can live in it. You're refinishing your floors, you're painting, you're putting a new roof on a historic building. You can get special tax valuation. So it's a substantial rehabilitation, which means 25% of the structure's value. And I'm gonna go to my example slide. So you look at the building value, and on your assessment, you have a building value and a land value. So 25% of the building's value. So in this case, if the building was $100,000 was the valuation, $25,000 is the minimum you have to spend to meet that threshold. So let's say in this case, they actually spent $75,000. So what happens is the building continues to be assessed on the normal schedule. It's not a tax freeze. But that $75,000 that those people invested in that building is subtracted from their assessed value for a period of 10 years. So, as I said, it's not a freeze, so the assessment's going to keep going up, but they get to take advantage of that money that they put into the building is going to be subtracted from their assessed value. Now, a huge project like a Davenport Hotel in Spokane would actually be able to zero out their property taxes for a period of time, because the actual special valuation can go into the land value, even though it isn't taken into consideration on the 25% threshold. You actually do get to subtract it from the full value of the assessment. So you're in this case taxed on $50,000 for that first year. See, 5 minutes, 1 minute left. So this is my short CLG presentation. Felt like it took about 7 minutes. In conclusion, I would say local preservation really, it can be a catalyst for your community. It can help spark economic development. It can be that sense of pride people feel in their neighborhoods, their downtowns. It can help protect your community's identity and character through design review, through local listings. That there are incentives out there, and there are additional incentives that local governments have taken. Building code, relief in some cases, various things that don't happen across the board, but all CLGs have special valuation. And only you at the local level know what's worth protecting. In Olympia, we do our best to get out there in communities, but you're the ones that drive down your streets. You see what happens on a day-to-day basis. They really don't do it they don't know in Washington, D.C. We don't necessarily know in Olympia, so we rely on you as a partner. So that's the CLG program and local preservation. Thanks for listening.